Good evening, friends. I want to welcome you again, our favorite friends and faithful supporters of the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. This is our third and final talk in our Local Luminaries series, the talk series that is designed for and limited to our most generous donors. My name is Karen Clark, and I am the chair of the foundation. For the past 30 years, the foundation has supported the library with cash gifts for special library items not included in the city funding and a variety of high-quality programs and lectures. If not for your generous support, most of these library enhancements and programs would not exist, so we thank you. To make sure that you know how much you're appreciated in this strange lockdown year of COVID, we've put together this special speaker series of truly extraordinary UCI professors for you to listen to and learn from in order to thank you for your support. In the first of the three talks, we heard from law professor Michelle Goodwin on issues related to race. Then we heard from Professor Rick Hassan about the frightening pitfalls and perils of the upcoming election. And tonight, we're going to hear from Professor Elizabeth Loftus. If you miss any of these talks, we'll be sending the links to you so you'll be able to listen to them later and watch them later. Before we start, I want to point out that our speaker will answer as many questions as she's able. So if you have questions, please type them on the bottom of your screen in the Q&A section. You should have a button at the bottom of your screen that just says Q&A, and if you click on it, it will allow you to type in a question. And then we'll get to the questions at the end of the program. So I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker and her interviewer. Professor Elizabeth Loftus is a distinguished professor at UCI. She holds positions in the departments of psychological science, law, criminology, law and society, and cognitive science. She received her PhD in psychology from Stanford and taught for 29 years at University of Washington before coming to UCI. Dr. Loftus studies human memory, in particular how memories can be changed by things that we are told after the fact, and how false memories can be implanted. She studied the unreliability of eyewitness testimony for her entire academic career. Her field is controversial. This is not surprising, since her research puts into question not only the validity of alleged repressed memories, but also many criminal convictions that are based on eyewitness testimony. She has been an expert witness or consultant in hundreds of legal cases, many of which are very familiar to us. McMartin's preschool, Oliver North, the officers accused in the Rodney King beating, the Menendez brothers, Michael Jackson, the Bosnian war trials in The Hague, the Oklahoma bombing, Martha Stewart, and the Duke University lacrosse team, and many others. Dr. Loftus has received 7 honorary doctorates. She has been elected to membership in several prestigious academic societies, including the National Academy of Sciences. She has also received the prestigious UCI Lauds and Laurels Faculty Achievement Award. My favorite factoid about our speaker is that in a study by the journal Review of General Psychology, the 100 most eminent psychologists of the 20th century were identified. Professor Loftus was the top ranked woman in this list. So as you can see, we have an exceptionally accomplished speaker tonight. Now, Dr. Loftus will be interviewed by her friend and colleague, Dean Nancy Guerra. Dr. Guerra is Dean of the School of Social Ecology at UCI, as well as professor in the Department of Psychological Science. Dean Guerra received her BA from UCLA, as did Dr. Loftus, and her doctorate from Harvard. Dean Guerra's field of study focuses on preventing youth violence and promoting healthy youth development. Much of her more recent work has had an international focus, and she consults with international agencies such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. Welcome you both, and thank you again. It's good to see you. So we're going to start tonight with the first part of a TED Talk that Dr. Loftus gave in Scotland a few years ago. We want you to look at this just to get a preliminary understanding of the importance of her work and questions regarding fairness and truth in the criminal justice system. So let's get that TED Talk going.
I'd like to tell you about a legal case that I worked on involving a man named Steve Titus. Titus was a restaurant manager. He was 31 years old. He lived in Seattle, Washington. He was engaged to Gretchen, about to be married. She was the love of his life. And one night, the couple went out for a romantic restaurant meal. They were on their way home, and they were pulled over by a police officer. You see, Titus's car sort of resembled a car that was driven earlier in the evening by a man who raped a female hitchhiker. And Titus kind of resembled that rapist. So the police took a picture of Titus. They put it in a photo lineup. They later showed it to the victim, and she pointed to Titus's photo. She said, "That one's the closest." The police and the prosecution proceeded with a trial, and when Steve Titus was put on trial for rape, the rape victim got on the stand and said, "I'm absolutely positive that's the man." And Titus was convicted. He proclaimed his innocence. His family screamed at the jury. His fiancée collapsed on the floor sobbing, and Titus is taken away to jail. So what would you do at this point? What would you do? Well, Titus lost complete faith in the legal system, and yet he got an idea. He called up the local newspaper. He got the interest of an investigative journalist, and that journalist actually found the real rapist, a man who ultimately confessed to this rape, a man who was thought to have committed 50 rapes in that area, and when this information was given to the judge set Titus free. And really, that's where this case should have ended. It should have been over. Titus should have thought of this as a horrible year, a year of accusation and trial, but over. It didn't end that way. Titus was so bitter. He'd lost his job. He couldn't get it back. He lost his fiancée. She couldn't put up with his persistent anger. He lost his entire savings, and so he decided to file a lawsuit against the police and others whom he felt were responsible for his suffering. And that's when I really started working on this case, trying to figure out how did that victim go from "that one's the closest" to "I'm absolutely positive that's the guy." Well, Titus was consumed with his civil case as he spent every waking moment thinking about it, and just days before he was to have his day in court, he woke up in the morning, doubled over in pain, and died of a stress-related heart attack. He was 35 years old. So I was asked to work on Titus's case because I'm a psychological scientist. I study memory. I've studied memory for decades. And if I meet somebody on an airplane, this happened on the way over to Scotland, if I meet somebody on an airplane and we ask each other, "What do you do? What do you do?" and I say, "I study memory," they usually want to tell me how they have trouble remembering names, or they've got a relative who's got Alzheimer's or some kind of memory problem. But I have to tell them, I don't study when people forget. I study the opposite, when they remember things that didn't happen or remember things that were different from the way they really were. I study false memories. Unhappily, Steve Titus is not the only person to be convicted based on somebody's false memory. In one project in the United States, information has been gathered on 300 innocent people, 300 defendants who were convicted of crimes they didn't do. They spent 10, 20, 30 years in prison for these crimes, and now DNA testing has proven that they're actually innocent. And when those cases have been analyzed, 3/4 of them are due to faulty memory, faulty eyewitness memory. Well, why? Like the jurors who convicted those innocent people and the jurors who convicted Titus, many people believe that memory works like a recording device. You just record the information, then you call it up and play it back when you want to answer questions or identify images. But decades of work in psychology has shown that this just isn't true. Our memories are constructive. They're reconstructive. Memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page. You can go in there and change it, but so can other people. I first started studying this constructive memory process in the 1970s. I did my experiments that involved showing people simulated crimes and accidents and asking them questions about what they remember. In one study, we showed people a simulated accident, and we asked people how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And we asked other people how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And if we asked the leading smash question, the witnesses told us the cars were going faster. And moreover, that leading smashed question caused people to be more likely to tell us that they saw broken glass in the accident scene when there wasn't any broken glass at all. In another study, we showed a simulated accident where a car went through an intersection with a stop sign, and if we asked a question that insinuated it was a yield sign, many witnesses told us they remember seeing a yield sign at the intersection, not a stop sign. And you might be thinking, well, you know, these are filmed events, they're not particularly stressful. Would the same kind of mistakes be made with a really stressful event? In a study we published just a few months ago, we have an answer to this question. Because what was unusual about this study is we arranged for people to have a very stressful experience. The subjects in the study were members of the US military who were undergoing a harrowing training exercise to teach them what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. And as part of this training exercise, these soldiers are interrogated in an aggressive, hostile, physically abusive fashion for 30 minutes. And later on, they have to try to identify the person who conducted that interrogation. And when we feed them suggestive information that insinuates it's a different person, many of them misidentify their interrogator, often identifying someone who doesn't even remotely resemble the real interrogator. And so what these studies are showing is that when you feed people misinformation about some experience that they may have had, you can distort or contaminate or change their memory. Well, out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation not only if we're questioned in a leading way, but if we talk to other witnesses who might consciously or inadvertently feed us some erroneous information, or if we see media coverage about some event we might have experienced. All of these provide the opportunity for this kind of contamination of our memory.
So hello, everybody, and that was quite interesting, the limits of technology, but we did hear it, and we saw you in freeze frame. Now we get to see you in live. I hope that everybody who's here today will actually take a look at the whole TED Talk, because it's very fascinating. And you did describe some of the studies, some of the key studies in false memory and in the malleability of memory. I thought maybe we could start, if you could kind of tell the audience a little bit about some other findings, or what are kind of the most significant kind of bullet points of the work that you've done to share with folks?
Well, what that first part of the TED Talk was about is to illustrate, some of the work that I did on what's now called the misinformation effect, where we have shown that you can expose people to some event like a crime, an accident, or any kind of event. You can then supply them with some new misleading information, and many people will pick up on that misinformation, incorporate it into their memory, and it causes an alteration, a contamination, a distortion in memory. And so the examples that would have been illustrated if the technology was working a little bit better would have shown you how we could make people believe the car went through a yield sign instead of a stop sign. We could make people misidentify perpetrators who had essentially assaulted them. It's pretty easy to distort people's memories for the details of events that they'd actually experienced. And hundreds and hundreds of studies have now documented this phenomenon of the misinformation effect.
Well, I have a related question. Are there some people who aren't susceptible to that, or really can everybody have their memory distorted?
Well, that psychologists love to look at individual differences, and they've done that in this area too. So yes, there are some people who are more susceptible to falling sway to this kind of contamination. People, for example, who are somewhat low in cognitive ability as measured by standard tests of cognitive ability are a little bit more susceptible. People who are particularly cooperative people are a little more susceptible. People who tend to have lapses in memory and attention frequently can't remember, did I do something or did I just think about doing that thing? They're a little bit more susceptible. But, for the people in our audience who know something about correlations, I mean, these correlations are on the order of like 0.3 or something, statistically significant, but not overwhelming. Most of us are susceptible potentially to having our memories be tampered with by suggestive information.
And are there any age differences? Do we see changes over time? Or young people?
Lots of age differences. Everyone? I mean, with young children and the elderly being somewhat more susceptible to this absorbing this kind of misinformation and falling for it.
Really interesting issue is the whole ethics of using scientific research in criminal cases. And, in general, you tend to represent one side of a criminal trial, usually the defense. So how does that play out for you? Do you consider the likelihood that a defendant is guilty before you testify? Does that matter to you? Or do you just kind of present the research independent of who you're representing?
Well, it is true that generally it's the prosecution that has an eyewitness who's testifying based on the witness's memory against a defendant. And generally, a defense attorney is the one who seeks information because there's such an overwhelming embracing of memory, particularly when it's expressed with a lot of confidence, that it's usually the defense that wants to bring in the science of memory to correct some of the misconceptions about the workings of memory. And of course, the prosecution, they have their own people who, in one way or another, even though they don't assert this in exactly this way, will try to bolster the testimony of prosecution witnesses. But I guess in my own case, when I first started doing this many decades ago, I didn't believe it was my job to inquire about whether somebody is guilty or not, but we've all paid for the science. We should all have access to the science, and if somebody wants to present some scientific information, it wasn't up to me to worry about it. A little bit later in life, since I have so many opportunities, I would probably prefer to work on cases where I think there's a good chance that somebody is innocent, either completely innocent, or maybe, if you want to put it this way, partially innocent, where they are maybe not, maybe they're being overcharged for what some event is worthy of. But that's something. I present the science of memory, and it's not my job it's the jury's job to then decide if the person is guilty or not.
Now I know there have been repercussions for you professionally and I don't know, personally as well. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the unexpected repercussions you've had. So have there been repercussions against
Oh,
you
yeah.
professionally? Maybe you could tell our listeners about some of those.
No, well, it really, because sometimes some of these cases are very sensitive, particularly if it's a case that involves sex abuse or sexual assault. There are a lot of emotions around that, and some people in this society don't like it when people help the individuals who are accused of these crimes. And so when I began to speak out about the fact that many of these accusations are legitimate, but a number of them are not legitimate, and innocent people are getting accused, as was the case with Steve Titus, people didn't like that. So what do? They faced, letter writing campaigns to the president of the university to try to get me fired, or threats to organizations that had invited me to speak, or a lawsuit from somebody who had accused her mother of sexual abuse, but didn't like the fact that I investigated that case and felt that there was some decent chance that the accused mother was innocent of these accusations. And so she filed a lawsuit over my investigation. So yeah, there have been some unpleasant things that have happened as a result of doing this kind of work.
Have you had any professional repercussions in the field of psychology, for example?
Well, it's hard to know. Maybe you as dean might know a little better. I mean, it hasn't, I've had a lot of, grief thrown at me, but at the same time, I've also won a whole lot of awards and for speaking out and standing up for science. And these are awards that I'm of course very proud of.
No, I would definitely agree that as we heard, you're one of the leading psychologists in the world. And I wanted to mention to our viewers or our audience here that in the school we call you Dame Elizabeth because you're school royalty. So when I talk to her, I call her Dame Elizabeth. So let's shift a little bit now to the whole area of repressed memory. And can you tell people a little bit about what we mean by that and how it plays out?
Sure. Well, the idea of these repressed memories is the idea that we can have horrific traumas happen to us, a collection of horrible traumas. For example, being raped for 10 years, which is an example in one of the cases that I was involved in, and allegedly banishing all these memories into the unconscious, being completely unaware of them until the person goes into some kind of psychotherapy and becomes aware that she had these experiences. She then might sue her father or alleged abuser. And the real question is, what is the evidence for this kind of massive repression? There's certainly evidence that people cannot think about things and be reminded of them. They cannot think about things for a long time, even awful things, and be reminded of them. But the idea that we have some sort of mechanism where you could take a decade's worth of horrific traumas, bury it in the unconscious, and reliably recover it later, there's no credible scientific support for this. And so I've been trying to speak out about using this kind of information in criminal and civil cases to affect the lives of people who are quite possibly quite innocent.
And you wrote that you got involved in the memory wars because of the case of George Franklin. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Oh yeah, that was a fascinating case. George Franklin, that's how I got involved with repressed memories. I got a call from a lawyer. His name is Doug. Doug says, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I've got a client, he's accused of murder. He told me he had been a public defender, which for me meant he had a lot of trial experience. He was now in private practice. He'd handled many murder cases, but he had a murder case he couldn't figure out, and could I help him think about this? George Franklin was accused of murdering a little girl, an 8-year-old girl, 20 years earlier, and the only evidence against him was the testimony of his 28-year-old daughter, who said she saw the father kill the little best friend and buried the memory for 20 years, and now the memory's back. So what do you know about repressed memory? And that's when I started to look into the literature. What do we know about it? And that's when I became fairly convinced that this hand-me-down Freudian idea has been floating around for a long time, but there is no really credible scientific support for it. And yet George Franklin was convicted of this murder. He spent about 5 or 6 years in prison until a federal judge overturned his conviction. And he was never re-prosecuted because there were quite a few problems with his daughter's memory. She came up with other murder memories and other kinds of trauma memories that didn't have any support. So interesting. I recently now Netflix is going to make a documentary about this case. So there's a lot of recent public interest in this case that really launched the memory wars.
And is it true that the memories are kind of facilitated by the interviewers, or do they just spontaneously erupt? What causes someone to come up with these false memories?
Well, we don't know the details in Eileen Franklin, the daughter's memory. We know she was in therapy, but we also, she had very many different versions of how her memory came back. But I can give you an example of what happens in many of these cases that I've been involved in over the last couple of decades. She goes into therapy. She has maybe a depression or an eating disorder, or she's anxiety. And the therapist says something like, you know, everyone I've seen with those symptoms was sexually abused as a child. Wonder if anything like that happened to you. Patient says, no, nothing like that with me. And well, you know, many people repress their memories. Some of these therapists will inform their patients. And you'll need to recover these repressed memories in order to heal yourself, in order to get over these problems. And so there begins a series of practices, guided imagination, sexualized dream interpretation, recommending books that advance the theory of repression. And you end up with somebody now who has a whole collection of lurid abuse memories that they think they repressed and recovered. That's an example of the kind of things that went on in hundreds and hundreds of cases.
So in some way, there's some similarities between asking people what speed they were going when they crashed or when they hit. You're suggesting by the conversation and kind of priming for that. So you could see maybe the false memory having some similarity with the eyewitness identification mistakes.
Well, I do, because the link in the two cases is the power of suggestion to get you to remember things that didn't happen. In one case, you're remembering details differently for events that really did happen. In the other case, you're actually constructing entire events. And we call these now rich false memories. and the last 25 years have produced a string of studies showing that you can get people to remember all kinds of things that never happened to them, that they were nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, that they were attacked by a vicious animal, that they committed a crime as a teenager, that it was serious enough that the police came to investigate. All of these things these kinds of memories have been planted in these psychological studies.
And I'm kind of curious, why do you call them rich false memories?
Well, we needed a name. I made that up. And so, I mean, we needed a name that would reflect the idea that we're doing more than just changing a detail here and there. We're creating an entire memory. And we think we're studying how it is that you can just plant a seed, and out of that, a whole giant memory will grow.
Wow. And are you doing any current studies in this area? Or maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your most interesting recent or current studies.
Well, sure. I love doing that. A couple of collaborations with international collaborations right now. One with some Irish psychologists who we've looked at political false memories, and we found that people are much more willing to accept misinformation and distort their memory about someone who has an opinion that is opposite of theirs. Someone, you know, in the Irish study, for example, we were looking at voters in a referendum on abortion. Ireland had the most restrictive abortion laws until they recently changed them in a referendum. And we found that these voters were more susceptible to believing in a false news story if it made their opponents look bad. So these are kind of motivated false memories, and I think they're particularly relevant in the current climate where there is so much political dissension that, you know, we can see that people who have one set of political beliefs are just going to be far more likely to glom onto and accept misinformation, fake news about, you know, something that makes the other side look bad. And it's I think it's another way to think about the disagreements we have, and then maybe figure out does it lead to a solution for essentially how we can all get along better.
Well, can you undo false memories just as you can implant them? Can you unimplant them?
Well, as you know, at the end of every experiment, there is debriefing. So at the end of these experiments where we have made these suggestions, we've gotten people to believe and remember things, we do debriefing. The exact nature of it is a little different depending on, you know, what human ethics committee is in place at the time, but we might apologize for having to use deception. We want to make them feel their behavior was very normal. We tell them a little bit about what the study was about. And until recently, we didn't know whether the debriefing, you know, what was really working, because you don't see people after the debriefing, as you know. That's the end of your experience with your research subjects. But in some recent studies, we've now come back to people a while later and said, what now is left in their mind after they've been through one of these experiments and they've been through the debriefing process. And at least in one study that we just published 2 weeks ago, we have found that, well, one of the good things about debriefing is it briefly, at least, makes you a little less susceptible to further contamination. So we might be, you know, kind of helping to create mentally more resilient subjects as they go through some of these experiments.
That's very interesting. Let me ask you one last question, then we have a couple of questions from folks who are participating in this, and I encourage you to ask some additional questions in the Q&A, and we'll turn it over to you. But what would be your next study? So let's say I gave you $20 million to plan your next 5 years or 10 years of research. What do you think are some of the key studies we need to do?
Well, one of the things I think is important is what happens in the legal system right now is sometimes witnesses come in and they're not very confident about what they're saying. They're not very confident in their recollection. They're not very confident when they make an identification, of a suspect, that's the perpetrator. They say, well, like in the Titus case, she said, well, that one's the closest. But by the time she gets to trial, she's confident, she's positive, she's going to be compelling, and the jury is going to want to believe her and convict him. She's a genuine victim. It just happens not to have been him. So how do people, what causes this confidence inflation? And, there are some studies that show that what jurors respond to is the confidence. And they need to be told in certain ways that this confidence was not always that high. Something went on to intervene. How should they be told? Because they are overweighting courtroom confidence. And I think that's part of the problem. So I've been talking with some of my graduate students about how we look at this, how we look at juror reactions to different expressions of confidence, both at trial and how it might have changed over the course of the investigation. That's just one example of something we're looking at.
What do you think causes the confidence inflation?
Oh, I think these people are being given information. Good job. That was our suspect. By the way, we think we found a fingerprint. They're given information and it bolsters their confidence. It artificially inflates it. It makes them more impervious to cross-examination and more impressive to a jury. And so I'm hoping we can think a little bit more about this particular problem. I'll tell you about the study that we're just submitting right now is on push polling. Since we're in the midst of an election that's so important next week, do you know about push polling where pollsters are calling up people and asking them questions? And the pollsters don't care about the answer to the question. All they want to do is feed a little bit of suggestive information into the mind of the voter. They may not even record the answers because one of the classic examples is when the push pollers were doing surveys and asking a question like, well, your feelings about John McCain, who was running for the presidency in a prior election, would your feelings change at all if you knew that he had fathered an illegitimate, African child? Or an illegitimate child or something that kind of insinuates that he was doing something a little wrong, when in fact he and his wife had adopted this orphan from, I think, from Nigeria or some other country. But you see what I mean? There's a way to ask the question to insinuate something, to try to influence the feelings. You don't even care about the answer. And our collection of studies recently has shown that these push polls can really affect what people think and what they remember, and cause a whole lot of misremembering.
So again, it's suggestion, the power of suggestion.
That's the theme that runs through all of this work.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, let me take a question here that we have. And the question is, how has your work changed the way law enforcement agencies question accused suspects and witnesses to a crime? Certainly a timely question.
Well, first of all, it's not just my work. I mean, I'm one of many people in this space where we have been studying these kinds of problems, the application to the legal system, and so my answer to this is really based on our, our collective work. But there are lots of things that you can do, and the police can do, and they're learning this. They're learning this. There are things they can do. For example, simple things like at the time they bring a witness into a lineup or a photo spread to try to make an identification. What should they say to that witness? What kind of instruction should they give? We've done a lot of research that shows that you need to say to these witnesses, look, the perpetrator may or may not be here. It's just as important to exonerate the innocent as to convict the guilty person. You want to reduce the pressure on witnesses to pick someone, anyone, just to solve the crime. Another thing is who should conduct that interrogation. We've recommended blind testing, that the person who conducts it should not know who the suspect is. And that's really important because you don't want the interrogator to inadvertently cue the witness. You don't want the interrogator to give the witness feedback like, good job, you picked our suspect. And if the interrogator doesn't know, then those things can't happen. So those are just a few examples. Then there are things that can happen at trial, like ways to educate triers of fact, the jury in particular, about memories so that they decide these cases based on accurate scientific information about memory, not based on their intuitions and misconceptions that many have about the workings of memory.
Well, that's, I hope that things are changing, because sometimes when I hear about the interrogation processes, they're really shocking in a lot of ways. And hopefully your research and research of your colleagues and others will have an impact on that. I see we're really coming to the end of our time, and I'm sure people are anxious to go have dinner or whatever, but do you have any kind of closing words of wisdom that you've learned, or kind of things you want to leave us to think about?
I did when I ended that TED Talk, I thought, what's the lesson? What's the take-home lesson that I want to leave people with? And what I said at the end of the talk is this, that just because somebody tells you something with a lot of detail, just because they say it with confidence, just because they show emotion when they're telling you their story, it doesn't mean that it actually happened. You do need independent corroboration to know whether you're dealing with an authentic memory or one that's a product of some other process of suggestion, imagination, misinterpreting dreams or confusing them with reality. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us, not just if you're involved in the legal system.
Well, I think that's great closing advice. So I'll turn it back to Karen, I think, for some final words. If you're still there, Karen, we can get you.
I'm here. Sorry, we had a little power failure here, so we've been struggling with our own little issues. Anyway, thanks so much. Beth, I could listen to you talk for hours because everything that you work on is so fascinating, and it's so relevant today with all the issues with our judicial system, to realize that so many people get convicted on the basis of eyewitness testimony that is just, is very likely to be faulty. So anyway, thanks.
In the Innocence Project data, it's over 70% of those truly innocent people were convicted because of faulty human memory.
Well, that's right. And those people are lucky because finally evidence came out that proved they were innocent. And there's so many people still in jail who probably are innocent, but they don't have that DNA evidence or other evidence that can prove that they didn't do the crime. So anyway, thank you to you both. That was a great ending to our final Local Luminaries speaker series. And thank the rest of you for showing up and for supporting the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation.